So my name is Was Rahman. I work for the Open to Export organization. As most of you probably know by now, we're an organization that provides the online service at opentoexport.com that is there as the destination for SMEs from the UK that are looking for export support, export advice. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of sources of both private sector and public sector support. And with the help of our founding partners, the Institute of Exports, Digital and Marketing Services Organisation, HIBU, and the Federation of Small Businesses, we provide a lot of that. We work very closely with UK Trade and Investment, whose webinar platform we're using today. Part of what we do is a series of webinars that help you get started on your export journey. At opentoexport.com, we've got the rest of the program on. We've also got a question and answer forum, which works very closely with the webinars. Those of you that are registered, you'll see that there's the opportunity to type in questions, and our various specialist advisors and other SMEs will help with answers to those. One of the questions that people always ask about these webinars is, where can you get the slides? Well, if you go to the site, give us a couple of days after the webinar finishes. We do have links to our YouTube channel where you can see this and all the previous webinars that we run. They'll be available, and it'll take us about a day, maybe two, to get them online. Last week's webinar is already online. The second in the program talks about the choice of countries that you're going to be looking at for export and the strategy for getting into that country. We've got a speaker with us today, Julie Macken. Julie is very experienced at helping SMEs with this. She'll introduce herself. I've also got my colleague Gemma Price, who's been running our webinar program and is probably one of the people you'll be speaking to as and when you get your questions afterwards. Now, the final thing before I hand over to Julie, we normally have Q&A through a couple of windows that some of you already found that asks you to type in a question. That question shows up on my screen. I see it, and what typically happens is I feed it across to Julie, who then will answer the question, or perhaps I'll answer, and it'll get done using a kind of chat session. One of the things that we'll be doing later on is on a couple of the questions, depending on who's around, we might ask people to ask their question verbally, where we'll unmute them, so temporarily they become one of the speaker panel, and people will ask their question of Julie. And what I'd like is, if anyone wants to do that, just type in your question as usual, and let me know if you'd want to ask by just typing in. And towards the end, when we do our Q&A session, we'll do that. But as we're now 3 or 4 minutes in, I think it's probably time to get started. We're due to be on for around 45 minutes, but there will be the chance to hang on for 15 minutes afterwards if people want to carry on the Q&A session. Julie, welcome. If you could get started.
Thank you.
Let's hear from you.
So, hi everybody, welcome. Feels a bit strange talking into a screen. I'm used to talking to a live audience of people. So hopefully you are all there attending, and hopefully you will learn some good stuff in the next 45 minutes. So that was just a quick warm-up question, really just to get you thinking about selecting markets rather than letting them select you. All businesses are different, and a market that's right for one business is not necessarily right for another, but I always think this list is quite interesting. We sometimes, I think, get swayed by thinking that we need to be in the BRIC countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, or the new MINT countries, which is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. But actually, sometimes we forget that some of these smaller countries actually can offer us some potential. So my objective of showing you this is not to say these are the markets that you should be at in any shape or form, but really just to start your mind thinking and start the ball rolling in terms of you selecting which markets you think you can be the most successful in. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover then in the next 45 minutes. As Wes was saying, we'll have the chance to answer questions after each session. So we're going to have a session on choosing export markets. Then we're going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes thinking about how you develop strategies to launch in each of those markets. And then finally, we're going to look at selecting routes to market and how you might be represented in those markets. We'll finish the seminar at 3:15, but as Waz was saying, we're all happy to stay on the line for a further 15 minutes if anybody has any questions. So hopefully you'll get plenty of chance to ask questions throughout. Okay, before I go too much further, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Julie Macken. and I work with the Export Marketing Research Scheme, which is a UKTI scheme helping companies to undertake market research to find the information they need either to select a market or markets in which they're most likely to be successful, and or then to develop the best strategies to succeed in these markets. I also facilitate various UKTI training courses across the country, but I'm not a UKTI employer. I actually run my own business and have done so for the last 13 years. So I work with both small and large businesses, but increasingly I choose to work with smaller, more agile businesses because you, the people running these businesses, really make all the difference. Okay, so let's get started. What we're going to think about to start with is which markets should you export to? And just before you ask, I'll maybe ask the question for you. Well, why should we select markets? Why can't we just sell everywhere? Surely we'll make more money that way. Well, let's explore this idea. Right, now we're going to try something a little bit different. To make sure that you're all listening and you're all on your toes, we're going to have a quick straw poll. I think this is the equivalent of if this were in a presentation or a conference, it would be me saying, right, put your hands up, people. So what I want you to do, we're just going to spend a minute doing this, is have a look at these 6 statements and think about which one or more than one of these is most applicable to the way in which you've selected your export markets to date. So if you're thinking, oh gosh, I've not done anything yet, then write number 1 in the chat box. If actually you're thinking, you know what, I've thought about this quite carefully and I'm going to places that speak the same language, put 4 in the same chat box. If actually you found that you're exporting to Mauritius because you've always wanted to be there, then put 6 in the chat box. If it's a mixture of the 2, click 1, 2 and 5 or what have you. So just spend a minute or 2 in your chat box writing down just the number of which of these you think is the most applicable. Waz, I'm going to ask you to...
People are figuring it out. We're getting a stream of people that are using the question box to put in.
Excellent.
And so far what I'm getting is lots and lots of numbers coming up very quickly, so you have to bear with me. I think it's mostly a mix of lots of 1s and a few, and then just occasionally we're getting some 3s and 4s. Someone's put in a 5 and a 6.
Yep.
And that's the only thing. Oh, someone's coming with a 3 and a 6, which I think
3
is
and a 6. Great.
But the vast majority, you've got people that are either saying 1, 1 and 2, a couple are saying 2 and 3, a few are saying 2 and 4. That's where everything's going in. Now, none of the answers fit and should not fit. Someone said none of these have tested the markets.
Yep.
One of them has said 1, but would probably answer 2, 5 and 6 if I was exporting. So we're getting a few variations.
Yeah.
One person is to put almost everything down, apart from 6. And
Great.
So I think what we're seeing is the vast majority of people, without doubt, are saying 1, 1 and 2, and a few 3s. Very few people are saying 5 and 6.
Great. Well, thank you for having a play there, everybody, and thank you for staying on the line and joining in. That's great. You know what? There's no right or wrong answer to this. I've done this exercise in a number of different ways with all sorts of different groups. And most people, you get a complete jumble, and most people go, oh, probably a bit of everything, which actually is kind of the point I'm making here. Oftentimes, when we first start exporting, we have all sorts of reasons why we start exporting. And you know what? They're all probably really good reasons to start and get you on the journey. I guess where I'd like to try and sow some seeds in your mind just now is the idea of focus. Now, we've got about 5 more minutes to talk about this topic, and you could spend days and days talking about it. So realistically, I'm not going to get you to become experts at this, but what I would like to do is perhaps to challenge that little nugget of why can't we just sell everywhere? So there's probably 2 key reasons why trying to sell everywhere or being reactive to what your customers are demanding or what your friends said that you should do, probably a couple of reasons why this isn't a great idea. 1, you're unlikely to have all the resource to be able to do this. And 2, if you focus your energies, your time, your money, your people on the markets in which the potential is greatest, you're more likely to reap the highest rewards, get the most bang for your buck, if you like. So what I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes doing is just having a look at a way in which we can do this. How can we focus? How can we work out where we might get the most bang for our buck? So what I'm going to show you is a thing called the market selection tool. So what this is aiming to do is helping you to focus on being successful in a smaller number of markets rather than trying to sell everywhere. And if you can select the markets in which you're most likely to be successful, then hopefully you will make more money, be more successful, have a bigger business. So this is a simple thinking framework which should help you to create a strategy for selecting your markets. So let's imagine that you had 6 countries, let's say, which for whatever reason you believe could be a good potential end market for you. And I'm trying to get us to think beyond the simple, I know someone there or I once sold something there, really thinking about the potential of the actual market. So what this framework helps you to do is firstly to categorize countries into those with higher or lower potential. Secondly, to identify any additional countries or areas that you might have missed. And thirdly, to provide a short and long-term strategy. So the first step is really to identify what you think is driving demand for your product or service. If you are a firm of architects, let's say, specializing in town planning, then countries with a developing infrastructure could offer potential. If you are selling, let's say, upmarket kitchens, then you might find your demand track sales of other luxury products such as cars or foreign holidays. And it can often take a bit of brainstorming or lateral thinking to identify the criteria that are going to drive demand for your service or your product. And once you've identified these criteria, it's often relatively straightforward to find data. And I'll show you in a couple of minutes some useful websites for you. So how about this other axis, this ease axis here? What would make it easier for you to sell into a market? Maybe speaking English, or maybe something close to the UK, or maybe lack of corruption. Again, most of these measures are fairly easy to find. So let's say you found this information and you are now able to plot the countries to which you're considering exporting. Maybe you've identified a couple more while you've been analysing the data. You'll probably produce a matrix which looks something like this, obviously with the actual countries rather than just my numbers. So now, armed with this information, you're now able to develop some more robust strategies for how to approach these markets. So those countries, you can see the X I've put on the screen here, those countries where there is never likely to be high demand and where it will be difficult for you to sell to, probably shouldn't form the area of your focus. Now, if you receive an inquiry from one of these countries, perhaps you'll sell them some stock on pro forma, or if you're selling a consultancy, maybe you'll refer them to another business that you know of. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to expend significant resource on these countries. And I often find that businesses maybe need to do a little bit of navel gazing and ask themselves actually whether they are spending quite a lot of time on a country or market or region which actually is never going to reap any significant rewards. So it's probably better to focus your time, your money, your people where the opportunity is greater, getting more bang for your buck. So those countries with low demand and which are easy, you can see the ones in the bottom right-hand corner where I'm circling, these might be your target. Perhaps if you want to break your teeth on a small market, or maybe you might struggle to gear up to high volumes just yet. Or if capacity isn't an issue, or you thrive on high-risk situations, then maybe these countries that might be in this top right quadrant that I'm circling now might be those which you are more interested in. And then finally, this quadrant here, so those countries which are likely to provide a high demand for the solution you're offering, but which will be difficult for you, perhaps these are the ones that form a longer-term plan, a longer-term strategy. So maybe you might want to do some background development work, but not put too much of your resource into those at this stage. So that's a really quick whistle-stop tour of a market selection tool, which hopefully has prompted some thoughts. So before I move on to the next section, I just want to refer to some websites that might be of use for you. There are loads of websites which have statistical data to help you furnish this market selection matrix. This top one here, marketresearch.com, has all sorts of reports. It's a portal of market research reports, so typically they're for sale. Obviously, you've got the Open to Export website. NationMaster has all sorts of statistics. That's a good one. CIA.gov is the CIA, the American Central Intelligence Agency, and they have a World Fact Book there, which has all sorts of useful information. Market Access Database, this one here, madb.europa.eu, contains all sorts of information about taxes, import duties, VAT, all that kind of useful information that might enable you to make some decisions about where to go. World Bank obviously contains statistical and financial information, and then finally UKTI website contains some quite useful information as well. Then the last thing I've put on here is UKTI's Export Marketing Research Scheme, and this is the company who I'm representing today. Provides advice and support with a dedicated team of advisors to help companies to select a market, find information, create a strategy for entering that market. And there are advisors that can help you work through this sort of tool in a more detailed manner. There's also training courses that you'll find. UKTI offers training courses, and there are various other organisations that offer training courses to help you with doing market research. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Waz now, who wants to do just a quick poll, which will help the Open to Export guys in their targeting. And what we'd like to do is for you to think about which region you're intending to export to. So Waz, I'll pass quickly over to you now.
Okay, thanks. Julie, that was really very interesting. There's a slight change of technique just to check that people are still awake. It would be good if we got the answers, but what we're asking you to do is rather than type them in, because it's a little more onerous, we're giving you the option of clicking on your screen. So it's a slightly different style of poll, and that's so that we can capture the results and feed them in. One of the things that we're doing is making sure we're planning what we're doing with our content, with our partners and things like that. And so this is part of the very important information that we're looking for. And we're restricting it to these levels. So Patrick, I think you've asked about sub-Saharan, and I think a couple of you have asked about specific regions. For this level, we're doing this, and it's not because we're going to do anything very specific about countries. It's more to get a sense of what you need. While that's happening, there are some questions that are coming through. I think what we're going to be doing in a moment is getting to Julie to talk a little more about how you get into your launch strategy itself. And to do that, I think there are quite a few questions that people are asking about. If you can type in questions into the box that you were using before, I'll see them. And when we get to an appropriate point, I'm going to start asking Julie some of those questions. But for the moment, I think I've got almost everyone finished. Yep. And the results are primarily Europe, and a fairly even split between North America, Middle East, Africa, and Asia, which is, I think, a little surprising for me, because in the past, it's been much more heavily skewed towards Europe. But what I'm going to do is hide these results. We're going to take this away, and while we're looking at the information, I'm going to pass the slides back to Julie. Julie, you should get your slide coming back up any moment now. There you go. If you want to carry on, meanwhile, we've got a few questions coming through. Those that you've asked, it'd be useful to interact with the attendees. The way to interact is more to ask questions through the chat, and then we'll start to see what we can do to make it more interactive. So fire away, Julie.
Okay, so I'll go through the next section, then maybe we could have some questions on market research at the end of this. So let's move on to think about developing launch strategies. So having selected which market or markets you're most likely to be most successful, why can't you just jump on a plane and go sell there? Okay, I'm being a little bit facetious here to try and get you to react to this. This is what I often find, and we at the Market Research Scheme often find, is that people often assume that they can just go and sell their products. Many businesses assume that their strategy will be the same in all countries. Actually, probably a more accurate assumption might be to assume that it won't be the same. You can see the little picture that I've put up on the screen. just because your UK customer needs the solution you offer for the reason you've identified in the UK, it doesn't necessarily mean that your solution meets the same need in all markets. Just because you're targeting a particular type of customer in the UK doesn't mean you'll necessarily be successful doing the same in another country. Just because the price at which you're selling in the UK is working here doesn't mean this is the optimum price in all countries, etc., etc. You can see the point I'm making. So typically, there are a number of decisions which most companies probably will want to make before they try to sell into a country. Now, obviously, every business is different and has a different attitude to risk. But if you sell before you've established the ideal price point, or target people who simply don't have the same need for your product, or position yourself in that market in a way which isn't going to attract the people you want, then you really could waste the opportunity open to you, as well as potentially wasting a lot of time and money. So here's a list of the type of decisions that many businesses typically are likely to need to make before selling in that market. So I suppose the top one here is, should I bother launching in this market? And that's probably a decision that you want to make. And if that decision comes back as no, it's probably better that you know that rather than try and waste further time doing it. Another decision that you probably want to think about is, what product or service should I offer in that market? And should my current offering be adapted? What price should I charge? And you probably want to think about this through the supply chain if you are having other people throughout the supply chain. What sector should you target, or what type of people? What's going to be your key USP or unique sales proposition, or your key message? How should you promote? Should you be going to a trade show? Should you advertise? Should you use an agency? What sort of people should represent you in the market? What's going to be your best route to market? And what processes are you going to need to put in place? So there's a whole host of decisions that typically you need to make. Now, what we often find is a useful prompt to try and think about these decisions is the 7 Ps of marketing. Right, just to check that you're all still with us and all still awake. Does anybody know what any of the 7 Ps of marketing are? And if so, write them in the chat box, and Waz, let's give it 30 or 40 seconds to see whether we're getting anyone, and then I shall reveal.
First one you've got is preparation.
Preparation is not one of the traditional ones, but hey, these things are always being invented all the time.
I personally think it's a pretty good one, even if it's not on your list.
It is, isn't it?
We've got lots of people with product,
yeah.
Price,
yeah.
Planning.
Planning again isn't one, but that's quite a good idea.
Like a variation on preparation. Quite a few talking about promotion,
yeah.
Price.
Yeah.
People, product.
Yeah.
Price, people, place.
Yeah.
Price, place, product, promotion, people. There's quite a few people that are showing off they know most of these.
Yeah.
Price, position, plan. So there's lots of votes for planning. I think we've got an audience.
And you know what? The traditional 4, I'll do a reveal now. The traditional 4 Ps of marketing are product, price, place, promotion. And then some clever decided that he wanted to put another 3 down there. So we have now supposedly people, process, and physical evidence, although I have heard other people say, oh, it should be planning, oh, it should be. So I don't think packaging, yeah, and packaging can sometimes physical evidence can be used as packaging.
And so I need to mention the last one is profits.
Profit, well, and that's obviously a really important overriding one, isn't it? So the idea of this is, I find it sometimes helps when people are planning their launch strategy. The very first step is often, what decisions do I need to make in order to be successful there? And I find if you write the 7 Ps down on a piece of paper, it can often prompt you to think about, these are the decisions I need to make. So really this very closely replicates the slide that I showed before. I think it just helps to see how these 7 Ps can help. So if these are the sorts of decisions that, imagine you could wave a magic wand and you have the answers to all these decisions, you would probably have the ideal launch strategy in that country, and you would take away most of the risk and enhance your chances of success. So how do you make these decisions? Well, decisions are typically made from information. So therefore has the question, how can I find the information to make these decisions? Now, there's a certain amount of information you can find through desk research in the UK, and again, the websites that I showed you earlier can really help you with those. But there's nothing that can replace visiting the market and ideally interviewing a broad cross-section of people who can help you understand what's going on, help you make these decisions you need to make. Now, this is market research, and it's very different to selling. You've not determined what it is you're selling yet. You've not determined the optimal price point nor the ideal route to market. You've not really worked out what it is that your product or service has that's really going to float these people's boats. So your objective is not to sell to the person. In fact, the most useful information is often found from people who, for whatever reason, don't like what you're currently offering. You can find some very useful stuff out to help you really make sure that you've got it right when you actually do sell. However, market research can be the start of a very good relationship. People generally like to have their opinion heard, and I've heard many people say that they did research with people who then became some of their best customers because they liked them so much. Just worth thinking about. I've heard many people do research with just one type of people. So if you wanted to go and research a market and you just spoke with distributors or you just spoke with customers, then you're bound to get a biased view. Whereas if you speak with a broader range of people, you can reduce this bias and get a clearer and more representative view of what's going on in the market and how you and your business can make the most of the opportunities. So you could speak with customers throughout the supply chain, suppliers, distributors, agents, retailers, maybe even competitors, end users, perhaps industry representatives, trade body members, trade journalists, PR agencies, government representatives, etc. I heard a lovely story of J. Crew, who is the large American clothing company, and the chap who was either the CEO or the senior marketing director there was on the radio, and they were interviewing him and saying, what made you come to launch in the UK? And he said, well, with all decisions, I start off with my gut feel, and then I do my research. And he said, I came over, he said, I spoke to retailers, I looked in the shops, I looked at various places in and around London. He said, I spoke to trade organisations, I spoke to government, I spoke to shop owners, I spoke to suppliers. And he said, and then I made my decisions. Then I worked out where I was going to position my shop, how I was going to promote it, who I was going to target, and what price I was going to sell. And I thought that was quite an interesting story from a successful US business doing their research on the UK. Okay, so the last slide in this section, and again, I said this is a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. So let's have a look at what help is on offer. So undertaking research overseas is not difficult, but it is time-consuming, and if you don't do it well, you might waste the opportunity. So there are pros and cons of doing research yourself or using an agency to do research on your behalf. If you want to get an agency to do research for you, then the UK Professional Association is the market research agency, and they produce a buyer's guide, and I've put the website for the buyer's guide up here. If you want to do it yourself, again, the UKTI's Export Marketing Research Scheme, EMRS, offers help and support, both advice and some financial support in planning, arranging, undertaking and analysing a research trip. And I've just put the UKTI's website here if you want to find out more about it. Now, Waz, we're at 3 o'clock. Do we want to spend 2 or 3 minutes having some questions on research before we finish our webinar with selecting routes to market?
Yeah, I'd like to, if I may. I'm not going to unmute people because that's not quite working. There were 2 or 3 people that had questions that I was going to unmute them, and then I got a little message apologising from them saying their phone lines dropped off or they've had to go because there's been an office crisis. So that's putting a curse on people. A couple of things. One is that we've got a gentleman that says he's reliant on a customer base that operates globally, or they operate globally. They've got a global customer base. The problem is that the regulatory requirements for each country is quite varied. He didn't explain what his customer base or product is. He dropped off the line. What's the way in which you'd look at regulatory requirements varying by country? Is there a strategy or an avenue for advice? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, my approach would still be to try and look at the potential in each country. So if he's got a wide customer base at the moment and he wants to expand that customer base, he could either choose to expand it, let's say 10% in each of the countries he's in, or focus on some key countries where he's likely to be able to expand it more. So I would say the first piece of information that really he ought to be thinking about is where he's most likely to be successful in his expansion plans. Once he's done that, if he wants to find information on regulatory side of things, I do find that market access database website that I put up does have lots of useful stuff. It's a Brussels website that contains much information. It tends to focus more on the EU. There are then other organisations where you can find detailed information, but if I was to try and put that in one screen, it would be hideous because it's so many different countries and there are so many different regulations. But I think the first thing he needs to think about is where he's most likely to be able to get success, and then try and focus down on that.
Okay. I would comment, but in the interest of time, I'll move on to something else. It's not a single question that one person has asked, but there's two or three things that are covering different aspects of this. So the context is that a couple of people have said, what's the support for Sub-Saharan Africa in future? There's great potential for Sub-Saharan Africa. Can I put it on the question? So that region is coming up quite a lot.
Yeah,
and then
interesting.
Someone that says the difficulty with Sub-Saharan Africa, which is what they're interested in, is that a lot of people seem to have quite a negative view about it. And so what that got me thinking was that if you do your research, particularly if people are looking at perceptions or there's a lot of emphasis on political risk or something, you might get an uninformed view or a distorted view that puts you off as an exporter. And I don't know if there's a way of mitigating against that.
So yeah, I mean, my advice is always get it from the horse's mouth. You know, go and do your research. Go and do your research. Either commission somebody to do it on your behalf, or go into the country and do it. But primary research that you do yourself is going to be the most reliable. So rather than someone said it's not very good there, work out what is good for you, and then go and find out what's happening in the market. Now, if a country is unsafe or you're not sure about that, then there's all sorts of places that you can get information from in this country. The other thing often about developing countries is they don't produce stats and things themselves, so you couldn't look at, I don't know, let's say how many cars are sold, how many phones are sold, how many mopeds are sold. Often that doesn't exist, but oftentimes there are aid organisations who collect that information. So often finding aid organisation websites can give you information, sort of second-hand, but pretty good information about some of the stats in those less developed markets that perhaps don't collect their own stats.
I think that's really the point behind the question. There are some markets that are better served by information than others,
Yes.
and therefore you might end up with a missed opportunity in particular on some of these establishing markets and countries.
Yes.
That's it for the moment in terms of questions. If you want to move on to the next.
Okay, so let's move on. And if there are other questions, obviously write them in the chat box, and we can easily
there are many questions.
Answer them. Yeah. Okay, so the final bit then, and again, this is a whistle-stop tour just to whet your appetite and give you some things to think about, is selecting routes to market. So most businesses will choose to be represented in some way in each market they enter, and it won't necessarily be the same in each market. So one of the decisions that you probably want to think about is how you want to be represented in each market, and then select the appropriate person, business or agency to represent you in the market. Now, some of you who attended the previous webinar, some of the bits I'm going to say might be familiar, so take these as a refresh, but I just wanted to skim over them for those who weren't at the previous webinar. So there are various ways in which companies choose to be represented in markets, and each company might choose to be represented in different ways, in different markets, depending on the product or service being offered. depending on the dynamics of that market, and depending on the culture in the chosen country. But we find most small businesses, small and medium businesses, typically choose to either sell directly, so be that B2C or direct to retail or direct to end user, or through a distributor or through an agent. So those are probably the typical ways in which an SME might choose to be represented. So let's have a look at the difference between an agent and a distributor. Let's have a quick think about the types of business who might use each of these. And then finally, let's have a think about how we might find an agent or a distributor. So first of all, let's have a look at an agent. So with an agent, his role is to generate interest in your product or service and provide you with leads. You pay him a fee, typically a commission, for providing these leads. But you are responsible for delivering the product or service directly to the customer and collecting payment from him. There are different types of agents, and some will hold stock, some will chase payment. There's all sorts of different nuances, but the key difference, really, the key thing about an agent is that you are responsible for getting the service or product to him, and he is responsible and for collecting the payment directly from him. I sometimes say to people, think about the UK estate agent model, where this is probably very similar. You don't actually sell the estate agent your house. He simply finds you people that might be interested in your house. Just a point worthwhile thinking about, in some countries and regions, the terms agent and distributor are used completely differently. So it's recommended you check you're clear about what you're agreeing to. So let's have a think about the type of business that might use an agent. And again, this is rather ballpark, but it can be helpful. So typically, the sort of businesses that use an agent would be large bespoke orders. So if you were selling, let's say, an aircraft engine and you wanted to find customers overseas, you would probably use an agent type model. Sometimes consultancies use agents one-off, and they sort of use them like a fixer, I would call them there. Okay, let's have a look at distributors. So with a distributor, he is essentially buying the product directly from you, and then he is then responsible for selling it on to his customers. And again, if you wanted to have an analogy, think about the UK retailer model, so where a person might sell to Tesco's or Sainsbury's and they then sell on to the customer. So what type of business might use a distributor? Well, typically these would be high volume, lower value products. And what about selling direct, business to business? Well, typically a consultancy or a service company might sell B2B. Many companies selling smaller, lower value products do start out selling direct to consumer, B2C, often via the internet. But many find that the growth is somewhat hampered by this route, and they often end up finding some kind of support or representation in the country in which they're focused. Okay, so let's spend the last few minutes then thinking about how one might choose an agent or a distributor, and this is often a question that people ask. Well, I think the first decision is, should you choose an agent or a distributor? And we've talked about various differences between them, and we've talked about talking with people, doing your research in the market to find out which is best. So that's a decision that you're probably going to want to make. Then you're going to need to think about, well, how am I going to actually find this person? And I have heard horror stories of people going to a trade show and picking up 12 distributors and just appointing them on the spot. And the analogy that I often draw is an agent or a distributor is really the equivalent of your head of sales or sales director or sales manager in the country of interest. So let's take that analogy through and think about how you'd recruit a sales director in the UK. What process would you go through? So the process of finding an overseas agent or distributor should be similar. So let's think then, if you were choosing a sales director in the UK, probably the first thing you do is write a job description or a specification. I don't know, something like, we would like this type of person, they need this type of experience, we'd like them to have worked in this sector, We're ideally looking for someone young, oh, I can't say young, somebody up and starting and with lots of energy, or we want someone that's experienced and has gravitas or what have you. You'd probably end up writing a job description to start with. Then the next thing you do is you'd probably get your job description out there. You might advertise in trade journals or in relevant publications. You might use headhunters. You might network face-to-face or use LinkedIn. Maybe you'd use a recruitment agency. There's probably lots of ways that you would go and actually try and find these people. And again, this is no different to if you wanted to find an agent or a distributor overseas. Probably the next thing you'd do then is receive a list of CVs or resumes, and you'd probably want to filter through these and shortlist those that you thought sounded like the sort of people that you wanted. Then you might interview them, and perhaps you might interview them again. And importantly, you'd probably then seek references. So if you wanted to find a distributor or an agent in a country, we would always strongly advise people to go and talk to other clients they have or have had in the past, just to check they're who they say they are and that they're actually good at what they do. Then, if you're employing someone, you'd probably agree terms, how much you're going to pay them, what hours they're going to work, etc., and probably exchange contracts. And then finally, you'd probably have some kind of probationary period. If this doesn't work out, then we'll part our ways in 3 months or what have you. So I guess one piece of advice I would offer is when you are thinking about choosing a representation in a country that you're interested in, just ask yourself, would I go through this process in the UK? And if not, then maybe you might challenge your way of choosing these people in the future. Okay, just a final couple of things just to think about. And again, not going to go into lots of detail there, but you're advised to make sure that you have contracts in place with agents or distributors who work on your behalf. And it's probably as well to seek legal advice before you agree to any such arrangement. Make sure that the legal system that you're using is appropriate for the country in which you're signing that agreement. There exists an EU directive on commercial agents, and it was set up a few years ago to protect agents working on your behalf. So even if they've not sold anything, if they've been working on your behalf and you decide you want to get rid of them, they could sue you for loss of earnings. So it's worth just being a little bit mindful of this. The US federal law is similar. And then finally, the Bribery Act. The Bribery Act essentially says that bribery is illegal and that you're responsible for the actions of your representatives in the country. Now, there are things that you can put in place to mitigate this, but again, you should probably seek advice on this one too. Okay, so we're pretty much at the end of the session. Let's just summarize where we're at and think about next steps. And then we've got a couple of minutes for questions. And then I think I want to hand over to Waz to facilitate the question and answer session. So let's just have a look at what we talked about before I hand back over to Waz. So we've looked at the importance of selecting a market rather than allowing them to select you. We discussed the role of strategy and the sorts of decisions that you're likely to need to make before entering a market. And we had a brief look at the various ways in which you could be representative in overseas markets. We hope you found this a useful discussion, and I hope it's prompted some thoughts in your minds. Now, we've got a couple of minutes for questions, and I'll hand over to Waz to facilitate the next part of the webinar.
Okay, that's great, Julie. Thank you very much indeed. If you could just tap on the slide to the next one. I think what that should show people is what comes next in our series, I believe. Okay, so quite a few of the questions, the reason for putting that up is quite a few of the questions are around regulation and pricing. And so just making people aware that there is a webinar on the 6th of March that gets into this, and so quite a few people will find that very helpful. We have, I think, covered quite a lot of information. The challenge is knowing what kind of questions people should be asking on a webinar where the answer is verbal in front of an audience and is useful, versus where people are actually getting into things that are a little more detailed. And for those, I've been telling a few people that they're probably best off making sure that those questions get answered on the Q&A forum, because we've got an opportunity through open2export.com. If you register and ask a question, you'll get a whole series of answers from a mix of private sector experts, folks like Julie that are in the business of helping SMEs. There's public sector, obviously, people like the UKTI trade advisors, but also your peers. I think one of the things that we're finding is that a really important part of getting onto this journey is realizing you're not alone, and there are lots of other SMEs that can help you. So that's one of the things that I'm suggesting to people to do. There's one particular question that I'd like to pick up on. Unfortunately, Vanessa, who's on the line, has got a stinking cold and doesn't want to, in case it gets worse. So there really is a curse about asking these questions. But Vanessa's question is that she makes and sells, or I presume she sells bespoke children's gifts from the UK. And it's up till now been UK-based, UK audiences, UK customers. But what she's finding is that folks from Spain, some of the international schools in the UAE, and some of the folks in the United States are actually getting in touch and asking if they could have her products shipped to them, even though she's not selling internationally. So in effect, she is exporting via people that are coming to the UK. Does that mean those are the countries you should be targeting, or is there a bit more to it than that?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm really glad that Vanessa's raised that one, because that's quite a typical way which businesses first start exporting. So my advice would be, no, not necessarily are those the countries in which she's going to have the most potential. Now, clearly there's some interest, or they wouldn't be talking with her, but what she doesn't know is whether that's just one person or whether there are another 1,000 people like them behind. So I think that she would be well placed to go through a process like the market selection tool where I showed, where she really starts to think, well, what is driving sales of, it was children's gifts, she said, children's toys, children's gifts.
Bespoke children's gifts.
Bespoke children's gifts. So what is driving that? What would dictate or what would suggest that there was potential in a market? Now, you could say it's the number of children, but that's not the case, because there's going to have to be something to do with GDP. So maybe it's the disposable GDP per capita, which you could say, well, if that's high in a country, then I'm likely to have more potential. Or maybe she could say, actually, I know that I'm going to track sales of children's clothes, for instance, and countries that sell lots of children's clothes might be those that are going to sell lots of gifts. So I think she needs to have a bit of a mini brainstorm to think about where is it, what could drive potential, and then try and find some information that's going to dictate that. Make sure she includes the countries where she has had some interest, because that's obviously a good starting point. And then I think people are often surprised that countries where they think there might be an opportunity actually might be smaller than they thought, and she could spend a load of effort trying to develop business in a country which actually was never going to give her anything back. So I think she's in a lovely situation. She clearly knows there's some demand, and I think it would be great for her to do something like that market selection tool, or some way of helping her work out the potential for a market, and then she knows that where she's focusing her efforts is where she's most likely to be successful.
Julie, that was very helpful. I'm conscious that we're at 3:20. We were scheduled to finish at 15:15. So those of you that want to leave, and there are a few that are sort of signing up saying that they need to leave, as you leave, you'll get a little questionnaire popping up. If you could fill out those for us, it'd be very helpful, because it helps us target the topics and the quality for future ones. Meanwhile, those of you that don't mind staying on for another few minutes, we're planning on keeping Julie kind of tied to her desk for about 10 minutes more, and we'll see what other questions we've got. There are quite a few questions there where people are asking about things like freight forwarders rather than freight brokers. And with respect, what I'm going to do is suggest to people that they put that in to the next webinar where we're talking about fulfilling your first order, because I think that's quite an important one. Might come if we've got time. However, there was a very useful question, I think, from Christine, where she was asking how important it is to speak the language of the target country. And I know that varies tremendously based on the language. That's an interesting one, actually. And do you know what? My experience from working with many different SMEs exporting is actually it's not that much. It's not as big a handicap as you'd have thought. I think it's, well, to start with, we're in the fortunate position that English typically is the business language. And it is
fairly straightforward to find somebody in a country who can be your intermediary, translator or interpreter, or many people will find a representative in a market, be it an agent or a distributor, who speaks the language. What I would say to people, though, is try and get an understanding of the culture, even if you don't understand the language, because the way people do things round there is often a far bigger influence or deterrent to whether your business will be successful or not. So I really am a great advocate in going to a market, speaking to a good range of people, understanding what's going on, understanding the way things work, and then working out how to be represented. And I haven't seen very many people for whom language is a barrier. I don't think it's as big a barrier as people think it's going to be. So I would say to Christine, don't get put off because you can't speak the language.
Well, just expanding on that, Julie, I think Christine's question very specifically was how important is it to speak the language, but broadening that, there are all sorts of questions that people have in mind around, do I need a foreign language version of the website? Do I be able to prepare documents for regulatory purposes in the language of the country? So while you're choosing the market and selling, it's one thing, but when you're actually running a business there, does it change into some hidden costs and risks?
Yeah, certainly. And I always think that's a really interesting one. And going back to one of those P's, what processes am I going to need to put in place in this market? And I'm glad someone mentioned website and invoice documentation. I always think it's worthwhile thinking through what will happen. So if I translate my website into French, for instance, what might happen? French people might start phoning me up and speaking in French. Do I have somebody French who can French speaking who can answer the phone? And if not, is that going to cause more damage than good? If I start selling to Poland, let's say, it might be sensible that I write on the invoice in Polish, this is an invoice, please give it to the accounts department, just in case it gets into the wrong hands in the business. By wrong hands, I mean if it got into goods inwards who didn't speak English, for example. So it's really worthwhile thinking, if you are dealing in another language and you are dealing directly, it's worthwhile thinking about all the interfaces where your business might come into contact with the foreign-speaking country, and just think about what processes you can put in place to make sure that the communication works.
And one of the things that I found, using Poland as an example, I did set up a business many years ago, and there were all sorts of regulatory things on the exact language usage that you needed. So an invoice had to have the word fattura on it or something, and get it right, it wasn't a valid technical invoice. So I think you're spot on with some of those. But I think it leads to something else that people are asking, which is how many countries at a time can you look at? Because if each one requires this much work, should it really be one market at a time, or should you be really going for it and trying to handle a number because you'll get a lot of revenue out of it?
So, okay, so that's $1 million question, and it's kind of how long is a piece of string question. And I guess I would look at the two extremes. Okay, generally, businesses which try and be everywhere to all people typically don't make as much profit as those that focus on the ones that they can do properly. So, and again, this is very much rule of thumb stuff, but we find typically small and medium enterprises will probably focus on 1 or 2 markets at a time, maybe 2 or 3. And that, I think, you can milk your assets better than if you try to spread yourself too thin. I'm speaking in metaphors because they kind of work in this case. I've met a lot of businesses who say things along the lines of, oh yes, I'm successfully exporting to 30 different countries. And when you plow down and ask, yes, but are you making money? They kind of say, well, I'm making money in 3, but in 27 I'm actually throwing money out the window. And that's not uncommon in my experience.
Okay, Julie, let me just add a bit more specificity to that one, because Christine's back and has got 2 examples. She's looking at Germany because she speaks German, but having said that, it's more expensive to advertise there than Poland, and so those seem to be her 2 choices. Does that sound reasonable to try for both, or are you suggesting it's one of the
actually, and if she's got two countries and they're not different time zones, or not very different time zones, and they're not hugely geographically apart, I think that sounds fairly feasible. If she was saying I wanted to try and launch in Poland, Germany, Japan, Latin America and Australia all at the same time, I'd probably say she was stretching herself too thin. But having two at once sounds exciting.
There's also a lot of, the only word I can think of, unfortunately, is synergy, but between the German and Polish markets, there's a lot of stuff in common. There's a couple of comments that we've got, one from Jane Stammers and one from Philip Pearson, just talking about some of the challenges they faced trying to do exactly what we've been talking about. His comment was that somewhere relatively, she's not used the word, but let's say innocuous, like the Belgian market, English not just isn't enough, but she's been advised she needs to put French and Dutch on her food product labels, which was a little bit of an eye-opener. Meanwhile, one of his biggest hurdles going to China was not so much the language, but obtaining an interpreter, which is a subtly different thing.
Absolutely.
Comments on those?
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I would always say, do your research before you start investing heavily in trying to launch in a market. And that thing about how should my packaging be is often a classic. So I've heard many people come full foul of realizing that they hadn't put into the costings that they'd had to get the language translated. Certain countries won't take certain types of packaging, so certain plastics. Obviously German is recyclable. Lovely example where a company was having a product that required boiling water, and they wrote on their packaging for America, boil the kettle. Well, Americans typically don't have kettles like we do. So again, that kind of fell foul. So it's really worth thinking about, what are you going to put on your packaging? What should your packaging be made of? What size should it be? You know, does it have hangy things? What sort of shippers should it use? And all these stuff, if you haven't thought about them in advance, can come and bite you on the bottom in the future and be costly.
All right, so you were asking, or you were mentioning million-dollar questions. One of the things that I think SMEs have been told many times, particularly in recent years, is that if you export, you're likely to have a healthier business, there's money to be made, etc., etc. But obviously there's a cost around making that initial investment and even figuring out which markets, etc. Most of the SMEs that I talk to, and a couple on the line, have been saying, how much more money can I expect to make rather than staying in the UK but looking abroad? Is it going to make a huge difference to my business? Should I be betting half of my business on investing abroad so that I can really make a mark, or is it a tiny percentage? I know it depends on the...
So, okay. That is very much, you know, how long is a piece of string? And obviously, you know, there are far more people in the world than there are in England. So one might say that potentially, of course, it's going to be, there is more market to be had outside the UK. I think the one thing that really is worth saying is that typically there is a cost in exporting. So therefore, exporting is a more expensive route to market than selling domestically. Therefore, if your price is the same in an export market as in the UK, your profit percentage is likely to be less. So therefore, that means either you take a lower percentage margin and hope that the volume is going to create some good profit revenue for you, or you put your price up in that market. And actually, that is one of the crucial decisions that people often forget to make. And oftentimes, a higher price means a more desirable product. You know, it's the perception of the product. And I think people often forget that. So I would say, you know, is exporting automatically going to turn your profits round? No, it isn't automatically going to turn your profits round. Could you make more money out of it? Yes, absolutely you could, but don't just jump into it with your eyes closed. Be really clear on what you're offering, what price you're selling at, and what sort of costs you're going to have to invest up front before you start into it, because you could end up frittering money if you don't do it properly. But definitely there is money to be made, of that I'm sure.
Julie, that's great. We've now just turned past, and I'm very conscious that we've had nearly 100 people who've chosen to stay on longer than the advertised time. So thank you very much, everyone, for doing that. And Julie, obviously, thank you so much for a fascinating webinar. We've had so much positive feedback from the people on the line. So I think it's been very informative. A couple of days' time, this will be available, the recording, on the site and on our YouTube channel. But for the moment, thank you very much, everyone, and hopefully see you all again, hear you all again on the 6th of March. Julie, thank you, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.